Well, good afternoon. It's probably about noon in Santa Fe, New Mexico, one of the world's most gorgeous places where my guest joins me today. Good afternoon here in New York City. Good evening, early evening in Dublin, for example, or places all over Europe and Africa. Greetings to people all over the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all over the world. The guest I have today is someone I have known since we were babies. We were at least opera babies, if not
Opera
baby
baby.
babies, because you were in North Carolina, I was in New York. But Nova Thomas and I really go back a very, very long way in the opera profession. It doesn't, on you, it doesn't look it, but we are very much veterans. In my case, my first work in opera was in 1972 when I was 16. And so it's really been a long time. I'm not complaining. But Nova and I met, I would guess, around 1983,
Exactly.
like December of 1983. I do
Exactly.
remember. Yeah.
I do.
And we have been good friends. We don't see each other all that often. And that may be the first thing I want to get to. But we always had a very strong regard and love for one another. And I want to put that out there for viewers who are wondering why we speak to each other as we do. I do want to say one thing, because Nova is working in Santa Fe. We are pre-recording this program for later broadcast. So we will talk about Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Opera, but this will be broadcast a little later in the summer. So, number one, Nova, welcome.
Thank you. And good morning, actually, from Santa
Oh,
Fe.
good
Good
morning. Okay,
morning. I
that's
am
right.
thrilled to be
True.
with you. I'm thrilled to be with my dear friend. Thank you so much, Fred,
Likewise.
for having me.
So Nova, I think that I want to bring up a topic that I just unintentionally alluded to, namely, a long time ago I coined the term planet opera. And by that I mean that there are people who work in opera, who know of each other, who admire each other's work, but their paths don't cross very often. Um, I have not been to Santa Fe, working or otherwise, since 1993. So that is a very long time, not because I don't want to go to Santa Fe, but my work opportunities in the summers came elsewhere. So if you have those opportunities and you schedule ahead of time, you tend to go where you have the work.
That's
And
right.
there are certain theaters in the world that I've worked at very often that I feel are sort of my homes. But then there are other very famous opera companies, such as in my case, the Paris Opera, where I've never worked, or the Opera in Sydney, Australia. I've never worked in either. I was supposed to work in Sydney, but 9/11 happened in New York and I chose to stay here. But apart from that, there are other theaters where the audiences know me and the artists know me and the administrations and so on, where I regularly go and have gone for decades. You too, as a singer and now as one of the best teachers in the business, um, have your places on Planet Opera where you go to, and our paths just don't cross, and we are in contact via social media.
Yeah. And I'm grateful for it. But it's very common on our planet to not cross paths frequently. But the intensity with which we live together and love and make something together are so very special that it usurps the element of time. We
Mm-hmm.
fall back into one another. And I think that has everything to do with the love of the work we're doing, the personalities that it takes to navigate this particular pursuit, and the fact that we are serving something bigger than ourselves when we're together. I just think that's so important. It there comes a time, in spite of the fact that there are certainly notorious egos in this business as well as all businesses, but for a period of time, whether it's only the 3 hours of the operatic event or whether it's the entire rehearsal period, we are all in a communion of serving something bigger than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that creates bonds and ties for lifetimes. And we fall back into one another in that very real and true blue way, simply because of what we were doing together. As wonderful as the social aspect of it is, and we all enjoy that. I hope your viewers know that you are a fantastic dancer, for example. But
I've not brought that to the picture
well,
yet.
let me introduce that to your audiences. This guy can dance. But at any rate, in spite of that, I think it's the servant artist attitude and
Mhm.
job description that we all share that keeps us humble to the art form and with one another, to recognize the servitude in one another. It's important.
Another aspect that I know is something you embrace, something I try to embrace, is the fact that as we get older and more experienced in the opera business, it doesn't mean that we become irrelevant. We actually, if we're good, become more valuable and wiser. And part of our job is to pass along, to teach, and to inspire other people in the profession. But I believe without imposing our values and our opinions, but simply becoming a sounding board for what these young people want to know, and they're looking for people to turn to. One thing I'm definitely get into our conversation today is the people that you and I, but especially you, have worked with, and what we learned from them is kind of astonishing. And my having begun in 1972 and having worked with figures, and when I say worked, I don't mean seeing, but I mean working with, such as Tito Gobi, Alfredo Kraus, Morella Freni were among my first artists. Herman Pry was another. And so when I have those people, and they had the generations before them, this gets passed along. And if we, you and I, in our crisis, pay attention to what we hear and know how to apply what we learned to passing it to the next people, we hope that they will be receptive and open too. I want to ask you one thing first. I think that a challenge has been things like YouTube and video and so on, that younger artists, younger people in our profession can access those performances, but they don't have a context. And therefore, they don't know how those things happened. And sometimes the sound is not very good. So if you have someone with a voice like Joan Sutherland or Birgit Nielsen that were just astonishing voices, those don't reproduce well on YouTube, watching on a computer or on an iPhone. What do you think is the most or among the most important things to pass along that you have learned? And we can talk later about who taught you, but the things you have learned that you then want to pass along. I think you articulated some of that with the concept of service.
It is about, that would be one of the first words that would spring to mind. First of all, I love how you have defined the limitations of these wonderful platforms that are now available to all of us to listen, that they do exclude the context in which something wonderful is happening, something live, something human, something of the moment. But that is the result. And in teaching, as well as in performing, one of the biggest challenges we have is the confusion of cause and result. And what we see on these platforms are the results of the real lesson, what it is. I think time, apostleship to the page. I think specifically, and you said we'd get into this, But because of my voice teacher, I was able to meet Morella Franey in Houston, Texas, before my own debut, which was to be Mimi in Bohème.
Mhm.
And I said to Miss Franey, can you please teach me what you know about this? You know secrets about this role. And indeed, she did. But her response to me was, Nova, if you will just do exactly what's on the page, you will have done more than to this day I've ever been able to do. I think that apostleship to the page is something very important. I think courage is another thing I learned. I think about my wonderful first teacher, and I was standing in the wings before this particular Bohème. And I said to her, wait a minute. She had walked me to my entrance, which gets me teary to remember. And she said, I'll go ahead. I won't be so cryptic. This was Eileen Farrell. And she
Well,
walked,
okay.
yeah, she walked me. First of all, she did my makeup and hair,
Oh.
which I have a small Polaroid of her doing. She said, I will do her makeup and hair. She came in my dressing room, and then she walked me up this spiral staircase to my first entrance. And we were there appropriately about 5 minutes before. And she was holding my hand, and I looked at her and I said, Miss Farrell, should I think about that E thing? Wait a minute, what should I really be thinking about? And she said to me, baby girl, when push comes to shove, you open your mouth and holler. And to this day, it's some of the best advice I ever received. Uh, Honesty, immediacy, authenticity. With another wonderful teacher, the value of owning who you are and finding the things in yourself that can help you inhabit a character, not merely interpret a character, but inhabit a character. To do so, calling upon my own life, my own self, my own body, my own imagination. That's an incredible lesson from yet a great, great mentor and musical godmother. The power of preparation, the power of study, uh, how important it is to go to the stage as a servant. Sitting aside everything and yielding self, yielding ego to the needs of the story. So, in these great people that have so graciously and generously populated my life, I have learned that context that you referenced. And may I add that from you, very early in those beginning days, 1983, I learned the power of kindness. You were at the Metropolitan Opera. I was a kid from a town of 500 people in North Carolina. And
And the
you
beauty salon was called Curl Up and Die. I never
remember
forgot.
BYE, curl up and die. Let's just be specific. But I remember singing on the stage and you standing in the wings for me. You had 1,000 things to do, stood in the wings for me. And I could see peripherally on that, in that temple, that there was a person I had just met who knew everything about this art form and was standing in the wings for me. So that's a lesson in presence. That's part of that context we don't hear when we listen.
Thank you. I have spoken with many people on the show about Morella Franey because she was, in effect, my first artist, so to speak, and the one who set me on my professional path. But I've never spoken with anyone about Eileen Farrell. And Eileen Farrell was magnificent. Eileen Farrell, for listeners who don't know, was an American singer. She had the gifts of a Wagnerian and a Verdian. She had a feisty personality, I think is a nice way to say it, in a good way. She was plain spoken. She also, better than any opera singer of her time and perhaps since then, sang jazz and American popular music incredibly well. So well that certain conductors didn't think that she was a serious opera singer, when in fact she clearly was, having all the gifts that one would require. I had a beloved friend named Brian Kello, and he and Eileen Farrell wrote her memoir together. And I commend you to that, because Brian in the book captured Eileen Farrell's very distinctive, salty personality and her no nonsense ways, but also her being very loving. It was not about being grand. It was about really putting it out there, as you just described for you, about, baby girl, you just have to holler.
Yeah, she was amazing, amazing. And I wanted to be a political theorist or a lawyer. That was my first desire growing up in North Carolina. And I went to Chapel Hill and wanted to go to law school, and kind of made a deal with myself, assuming the good Lord would intervene and take charge of all this. So I set up impossible circumstances. I had heard while at Chapel Hill, and I did a major in music. There was a purple album with Miss Farrell on the front of it in this big black lace dress. And she was singing things like Trovatore and all of these great, great arias and these things. But on the last section of the album, the last take, was a jazz song, He Was Too Good to Me.
Ah.
And I was moved listening to this, putting the needle on the vinyl, all those arias. I was overwhelmed by the sound I heard. And the fact that there was something I understood about what she was saying. And then there's this last take that just deals with text I understood, a medium that made sense to this 17-year-old girl. And I thought, okay, this woman knows something. That's an art form that's as big, if not bigger, than my own imagination. She had a way of making art that completely captured me. And so I said, well, if I could go to wherever that woman was and study with that woman, wherever she was, and I'd have to get it fully paid for, I would consider going to grad school in vocal studies. And through a very crazy and wonderful route, that's exactly what happened. And so I didn't go to law school. And that's what those first days were about. I met her. She was awe-inspiring while being so authentic and nurturing and loving. She suffered no fools.
No.
There was, in spite of all the falderall about her personality and indeed saltiness, there was something so present and something so honest and something so truthful and something just important. Fred, I knew from first walking across her threshold that this was an important spirit, and she would have a great deal to teach me. And indeed she did. It wasn't through the same technical vein that other people later in my career focused upon, but it was about the big things, the importance of text, the importance of bringing heart to everything you did, the importance of understanding what something was truly about, the importance of it being big enough before it was refined. I know you're also a lover of letters, as am I, and one of my favorite letters is the one where Michelangelo was queried about the David. There was something I'm sure I will misquote, but that how did he ever conceive of something so refined, so magnificent in every detail? And he said, "Oh, I got the rock out, the biggest
Yeah.
rock, and then carved away what didn't look like him." And that was Eileen Farrell.
And
Get
what's
the
remarkable
rock
too about Michelangelo there is that, and it's not often discussed, is that that was an imperfect piece of marble with fractures in the
the
grain.
trash, the trash.
And basically, other sculptors had already tried to work on that marble and could for anything and couldn't. So it was a piece in the junkyard outside the Florence Cathedral. And he looked at it and he looked where the fissures were in the cracks. And he basically said, I'll work around it. And what he produced was the David in 1503.
That was
It's
Eileen
remarkable.
Farrell. She drug the rocks out.
Yeah.
She drug the rock, crack and all, and then inspired me on a lifelong pursuit of my own David. But it was her attention to not volume, but generosity of sound, of spirit, of choice in music making. That was where I began and was life changing. Also, she was loving. Her husband, Staten Island, retired Staten Island cop,
Yeah.
made yeast rolls on Sunday. And so she would have me to her house for yeast rolls on Sunday, late afternoon, early evening. And one time I finally had the nerve to ask her more about her own career. And she took me downstairs to her basement and she opened one of those hatches that go under the stairs where you might store something, drug out a box of clippings, one of which was Collis's reaction to her Carnegie Hall concert in New York, where Collis ran out of the theater because she was so overwhelmed by the sound of her voice. And what was it she said? The Met has nothing if they don't have Eileen Farrell.
Mm-hmm.
And Miss Farrell shared a few of those things, crying as she said them. She said, "I would love to believe I made a difference like that." She was completely unattached to anything that went with being a diva. For her, it was about words and music and telling a story and trying to divine the relationship between melody and harmony and text. Why that? Why this choice? Why a dotted note? Why a high note here? And so to begin like that was quite something. She also shared the fact that some of the stories that she was most known for, including those with shippers and other famous stories about
Thomas
those
Shipper's the conductor. Yeah.
those confrontations, was that it was her defense mechanism for nerves.
Mm-hmm.
She said at the end of the day, she always felt like a fish out of water. She was always so nervous. And the sharpness of tongue and a sharp wit were her defense mechanisms and a way of living in that world.
There's another singer, and I've never really spoken about her with anyone because the occasion never came up, who I associate a bit with the era of Eileen Farrell because they were contemporaries, was the American soprano Eleanor Steber. And I never met her or got to work with her. But Eleanor Steber has the distinction of having been the star of the first opera I ever attended, and
Wow.
which was Butzek. And therefore, um, she made a very big impression on me. And people I know who knew her described her exactly as you just described Eileen Farrell. And Eleanor Steber was from West Virginia, and she was a wonderful artist, but she was not from, let's say, a cosmopolitan capital like New York or Paris, and therefore came to the profession and came to learn what she learned from a very different route than would someone in a conservatory, in Vienna, for example. Did you ever hear her, meet her, talk to her?
I met her only once. I think through the Met competitions at near the very end of her life, I certainly remember the sound of her speaking voice and via recordings, her singing in Mozart, her singing of Depuis le jour. I mean, I can think of things that I heard, but I never had the great pleasure
Yeah.
of knowing her. But the contributions of that sound are singular.
So because I want to be sure to cover a particular couple in great detail because you can bring perspectives that no one else can, I'm going to go right now to the subject of Joan Sutherland and Richard Bonynge. You and I both had the pleasure of knowing them, working with them, but in very different ways because I was involved in production and yes, I was in the wings for Nova Thomas. I was also in the wings for Joan Sutherland, like
That's
all
a
the time.
person to be in the wings for, yes.
I'm going to tell one Joan Sutherland story right now because there are millions. But when she did Puritani at the Met, before the mad scene, there was a tall staircase in this old rickety production that had been built for her and Luciano in 1972. And this was much later, and she was an older person, and she wanted help going up the staircase. And normally that would have been done by a stage manager, but she said she wanted me. I was performance manager, which meant I ran operations, and normally I wouldn't be doing that. But I assigned my assistant to take care of everything else because Miss Sutherland wanted me backstage. And what we did was we played a card game called Hearts. And we would sit at the bottom of the rear staircase. And it was my job to listen to the orchestra and know basically 30 seconds before her entrance. And so we would be playing Hearts, and she would always beat me. And at a certain point, I would say, last hand, Joan. And I didn't always call her Joan. It was often Miss Sutherland, occasionally Joan. But at that point, it was always last hand, Joan. And she would say, I'll win again. She'd put the card down. And then I would take her hand, and it would be her left hand, and I would walk her up the steps because the stage in the auditorium was to her right. And when we got 3 steps from the top, I would sort of put my hand behind her back and guide her up and turn her so my hands were never seen by the public. And this is what I want you to describe. Suddenly the jaw would go up, the eyes would widen, and she was in character, and boom, she did a mad scene. Now, number one, how did that happen? But number two, what is it about the way she positioned her jaw and used her eyes, the sort of surprise look on her face? Talk about her, apart from everything that she had and was, but there were certain signature things about the way she sang, the technical aspects that I was wondering about. But she would talk about the surprise look on the face, but also the
Yes.
way her jaw was so high.
Yes.
How
Well,
come?
she had an interesting anatomy. There was, I mean, the jaw just went straight back like this. It
Yeah.
was incredible. It just was a face and a head made for sound. But she was a very, very technical person. She understood the principles of changing the inside of one's mouth and uh, essentially a digestive and respiratory tract into a resonating chamber. When she inhaled, she created a biosphere through which the release of sound and resonance was so possible. Also, color. For her, for example, to be very specific, the positioning of the palette was not just straight up like a church steeple. There was a pharyngeal width in addition to the height that I teach to this day that was transformative in my own work. This, even Caruso said, always sing to the expensive seats. When we lift our chin, we undo this tension at the hyoid and base of the tongue. It provides a more open throat. She understood all of that. She was incredibly technical. And I think of the toolbox she brought to everything she did, perhaps the most important thing to her was breath. Maestro Pavarotti learned breath from her. So many people have queried her about it. I certainly learned from her. And that had to do again with creating a width in the body, specifically the rib cage and the back of the rib cage as it sits so to the spine attached there, where she would flare in the back, and she created space here, space at the base of the throat, and space in the body. So it was an open throat over an open heart. And everything she said was unconstricted, literally and metaphorically. What came out of her knew no constriction. And I think that's what people reacted to. Nothing stopped or stalled from the moment of idea to the moment of execution. And so you have described beautifully this pharyngeal positioning. It was too big to call placement. It was so much more than that. It was a position in the head and mouth, and the attachment to the physical foundation in the lower back underneath that made her so exceptional. She told me about it, and I witnessed it for myself up close singing with her. Having my hand on her back was something you can't imagine as she sang. Really incredible technician. And she and Maestro Bonynge to this day, so generous. It's an adjective I will use a lot because it was the biggest blessing in my own pursuit to have my path populated with people whose instinct was generosity is incredible.
I want to talk about Richard Bonynge in a moment, but I want to stick with Joan, and now she's Joan again, because most of the time she was Joan. Joan and I did things like go to Gimbel's, which was a department store in New York, to shop for sheets because she loved American fitted sheets.
Yes.
And she particularly loved, and I don't know why, the sheets at Gimbel's that had green polka dots.
I've slept on those sheets.
I know. I asked them once the Gimbel's, and they said to me, no one else buys these, but this lady, they didn't know who it was. This lady comes in with an Australian accent when she's in New york, and she'll buy 6 sets of these green polka dot sheets.
I slept on them in Sydney. I know exactly which sheets you're referencing.
But the thing was, among the things which is dazzling to me, and the first thing I heard her sing was Norma when I was 14. But dazzling was, let's go back to Puritani. So in Vergine Vezzosa is really 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes. It's not a long aria, unlike many of the others. But the cascade of notes, all perfect, all exciting, all distinctive. It was not just execution of sound. It was every one of those notes that would come forth like bubbles out of a bubble machine, yes, but each one different. Yes. That to me was in a way more astonishing than than Lucia Mazzine, great though it was, of course. But hearing her sing that in 3 minutes was just breathtaking. Well, how does one do that?
Well, I remember I was in Sydney. They invited me to stay for several weeks, and we were preparing for the Bow Girl, the recording of the Bohemian Girl. But I was using the time to prepare many things with her. There were important things, but specifically, since you referenced the coloratura, she had methods that preceded that fabulous madness. She assigned numbers to things. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then she would switch the numbers. So where the accent was, so that she owned these things in how they were organized from a very mathematical standpoint. She knew them. She also whistled her coloratura. She would sit at night, save her voice, do her needlework.
Needlepoint, yep.
and whistle the coloratura. She learned to sing by mocking birds in the backyard. She tells that story sitting under the piano of her mother, who was a phenomenal mezzo. But she had a real method of organizing it, learning it, and repeating it. And it was so habitualized by the time she got to a performance that the brain and breath provided. And she would talk about that. You inhale, you have the instinct and the intention for the phrase, and then let it go. And the muscle memory and the brain and breath provide what she had prepared for hours. And we know that that's just based in physical truths, how we walk, how we run, through the repetition and that kind of very specific ownership of something. She vocalized early every day. She would vocalize me in the mornings, early mornings. She was a very early riser.
What?
One of the ways she dealt with nerves, she got up very early and did laundry. I remember her coming, I was sleeping on their sun porch, which was this beautiful, beautiful space they gave to me. And I had a bed out there and it was so great. And I would awaken with the light and she would stick her head in and say, "Do you have any laundry?" And so she loved doing laundry. I was there for those farewell performances in Sydney, which were so magnificent. But
Did she ever make you breakfast?
I'm sure she did. I'm sure she did.
She
Yeah,
made
she
me
had,
in New York her equivalent of an Australian breakfast,
oh,
which was very laden with saturated fat.
yes, of course. Well,
You know,
how could one go
butter
wrong?
and grease, and even the breads were greasy, and they were delicious. I'm not complaining, but they were not what we would call a heart healthy diet. But they were
Probably not.
basically a get up and herd the sheep kind of diet.
Yes. A throat lubricating diet, perhaps.
True.
I don't know what she was so amazing, an amazing servant to the art form. And that's the specificity to the page. I owe such a nod to both she and Maestro Bonynge. They went to the art form with a real reverence and a sense of service and always unearthing the music. For my first Daughter of the Regiment, for my first Blanche in Carmelite, she attended my rehearsals. We were in San Diego and she attended those rehearsals. And she would sit in the back, do her needlework. I would go to her at the breaks and she would say something like, "Well, dearie, that trio was a bit of a rattle, wasn't it?" Now let's talk about that. But then she would also tell me when things were right and ask if they were repeatable, had I known what had occasioned a particular result. Maestro Bonynge, too, just
Well, before we get to him, because he's
yes.
important, but you just raised something that's so crucial, and I've never spoken about this with anyone in a public place. When singers, we could also say actors or dancers, but in this case, singers are in the moment where they are performing, are they also a bit outside their body paying attention to what they're doing, or are they completely in it and therefore would not remember what they did? I've often had, I would say to an artist, "I just love the way you did that phrase," and they would say, "I have no memory of it," because they were not analyzing or watching, so to speak.
I think uh I think both are true. And I think if we're all honest, both are true for everyone. There are those exotic birds who can completely relinquish self in the moment. Um, I always found, while it's my instinct, and while I'm convinced that maybe the very best happenings were results of that kind of letting go,
Mm-hmm.
as you well know, Fred, what we're doing is too complicated. It's so involved. It's so collaborative. There has to be a sense of presence. I don't think necessarily a manic academic attachment to any one thing, but an awareness of everything, if that can make sense, the
Mm-hmm.
difference between attachment and awareness. And so there is an awareness that calls upon that kind of left lobed, if I get in trouble, what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to reside there. We're a right lobed driven art form. Pitch itself is a right lobed activity. On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, words, rhythm, numbers is a left lobed activity. Recalling a staging. If something goes wrong, no matter how organic the process has been, or maybe especially because it's been so organic, I can readjust and quickly render an adjustment that's believable. So I believe that both awarenesses are required, but hopefully by the time we get to a performance, attachment isn't required.
Mm-hmm.
Even though sometimes there will always be. I don't care what anybody says. You know, to quote Miss Farrell, when push comes to shove, between the push coming to shove and the holler, there has to be a readiness that occurs to get ready for the release of something. And in multiple performances, habits are formed. And
Mm-hmm.
so then you can enjoy the benefits of repetition. But there are some things that always require a thought, a recall, a directive, an intention.
Now, you were one of the few people on this planet who sang Adalgisa to Joan Sutherland's Norma.
Yes.
As I said to you, the very first time I heard her was not the first time I heard her Adalgisa Marilyn Horne, who I had heard earlier when I was really a kid. But Sutherland and Horne at the Met in 1970 in Norma, conducted by Richard Bonynge, goes down in history the way, you know, football, soccer, baseball, whatever your sport is, any person can name events from the past in those sports, even if they were not there,
That's right.
because they're known. And everyone knows 1970, Sutherland, Horne, Bonynge, Norma at the Metropolitan Opera. And so when it is such a towering piece of history, obviously she went on to sing Norma with other Adalgisas, and one of them was you. And how did that come to pass? And what did she teach you? But also, most especially, what did Richard Bonynge, the conductor, and her husband, I put it in that order, what did he teach you?
Oh, wow. How it came about was a crazy. I had won the Metropolitan Opera competition, and I overheard, I was standing, you know how we always had everybody was around and about afterwards. And Artist Kranick was speaking with Miss Stevens, Reese
Okay,
Stevens.
so Artist Kranick was the head of the Lyric Opera of Chicago for many years and my mentor.
And a force of nature.
Yeah. So
He
when I
changed.
said I began at the age of 16, it was in Chicago. It was not New York. Yeah.
Well, what a blessing, Fred. She was a towering influence who forever changed the art form for the United States.
No.
Incredible. Another wonderful woman who suffered no fools. But she asked she was speaking with Reese Stevens, and she said, I heard her say, oh, we have Joan coming to do Bolena. And, you know, Joan never cancels. We're so excited, but we do need a responsible cover. We need somebody here. And Miss Stevens says, I've got a little girl that just won that sings that. I think you should hear her. Mm. So I went home to a room in New York City. And the next day, my phone rang. And Ursula said, we have a ticket for you. We'd like for you to come to Chicago and sing just on a Bolena, sing it on the stage. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. So it was right before they were beginning the production. I went to Chicago, got off the plane, went to the opera house, got on the stage, sang this for Maestro Bartoletti and Miss Kranick and Bill Mason. And I don't know if anybody else was there. I sang it. They were very complimentary. came to the foot of the stage to greet me from still however many feet that was. Thank you so much for having me. Few kind words. I left and I went back to New York, and I get another call the next morning. Where are you? I'm back in New York. Well, we meant for you to stay. So at any rate, here I go. At any rate, I went back and I covered Dame Joan's Anna Bolena, which meant that I sat in the corner and never opened my mouth, other than the fact that my jaw was on the floor. I was so shy. I was so inexperienced in this kind of realm of anything. Still being a graduate student, or just finished graduate school at Indiana, and just sat in a corner and learned and went, even when it wasn't some of the few moments that Anna's not on stage. I still just went and watched this incredible man at every rehearsal, Fred. Every rehearsal. Conductors don't do that anymore. Can you believe it? Every rehearsal, he's there, co-conspiring for a result that can only be described as magic in the making of music and this art. And I would just watch him, and I watched her, never said a word. It's the final performance. And Richard Amner, God rest his soul, took me to the dressing room. And he knocked on the door and said, I'd like for you to meet your cover to Dame Joan. And she said, oh, yes, dearie. I hear I should know you. Yes, I hear you know this well. And she was charming and lovely and very kind. And all I could say was, I've never heard or witnessed anything like this. Thank you. Thank you. Mm-hmm. He did the same for Maestro Bonynge, and I said the same. I've never seen or witnessed anything like this. He said, I understand you're well prepared. And I said, thank you very much. And I went back to New York, having my life changed by what I'd witnessed. I didn't have to participate. I needed to witness and learn, and I did. And then a few weeks later, less than a month, I got a call from Houston Grand Opera. And they said, Dame Joan has requested that you cover her Anna Bolena here in Houston. And she will not be arriving for any of the rehearsals. She will come when we move to the stage. So I went. Maestro Bonynge was there. I rehearsed with him. I rehearsed with Jerry Hadley.
Wonderful American tenor.
Lotfi was the stage director.
Lotfi Mansuri,
able to learn from him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was generous enough that he put the staging, not merely, he said, we have the time. Let's put it in your body. And he would say to Jerry, now, when Joan is here, she will not do any of this. She will just be here. But let's create this for Nova, which was an incredible thing. And gave Jerry another character to work with. Dame Joan arrived. I went back to my corner. And then it was the first big stage run through. Now I might get teary. And I got a call that she was not feeling well and that she would not go on that night and that I was to do the role. And they were going to start with the mad scene and then go back. And so I went, and HGO was so kind. They put my name on the door. Isn't it the silliest things you remember?
Oh, absolutely.
They made a sign for me for this one rehearsal. So I wasn't stepping, and they even gave me that dressing room. And I couldn't wear her costumes, but they gave me a skirt that fit, and they gave me the clothes and put my name on the door. And I went and I sang. We started with the mad scene, and then at the end, Maestro Bonynge goes over and he knocks on the prompter's box and said, tell that girl I'll see her at 9:00 tomorrow morning to bring everything she knows. I'll see her at 9:00 tomorrow morning. So I heard him banging on the prompter's box and saying something. And so I thought I was probably in a great deal of trouble, but they didn't send me home. And I did the rest of the opera. But the miracle, the gift, was that I looked in the wings and she hadn't been sick at all. She had given me the opportunity.
Yeah. That
And
was Joan.
so
I know.
that was Dame Joan. She gave me an
Yep.
opportunity
Yep.
to sing in a house those pitches for her husband to hear. And he, for some reason, decided to make an investment in me. And my life was changed. My life was changed by the two of you. I'm sure you do, then kindly you do. That changed my life. And it was not easy. They were relentless taskmasters, relentless, accepted nothing but the best I could possibly do. And that meant sometimes he would bang pitches. He taught me my first Trovatore. Incredible. He taught that when they were in New York for something and they were in their beautiful home in Brooklyn. I would go every morning and he would bang the pitches and put it in my throat. To times in when we were performing together, and I will get to how it happened, Adalgisa, in Detroit, and it was before my first Traviata. And so she said, "Oh, dearie, for our first lesson, we're not going to sing. Come to the apartment." I came, I brought my score. She said, "Give me your score." She had a red pencil and she marked she went through every page, and about 10 times in the score, she wrote, "Sing here, sing here, sing here." And so she had written that about 10 times in the entire score. And then she looked at me, she said, "And be prudent the rest of the time."
Mm.
Which
Wow.
was
Yeah.
thing to do, Adalgisa, simply because they lovingly and kindly offered after that interface in the covering of Anna Bolena. And then they invested and continued to, and changed my life.
You said something in passing, because it's the most normal thing to say, that I want to deepen, because it's something about the Bonynges that very few other people in opera could claim. In my experience of them, they were like an older theatrical couple, whether British or American. They were Australians, but there were stars such as Zoe Caldwell, who was Australian, London Fontanne, Laurence Olivier and Vivian Lee, people like that, who were theatrical couples in addition to being individuals. And for people who know Carol Burnett and Harvey Korman would do a parody of theatrical couples, and it was very funny. But the Bonynges, as they were known, were a theatrical couple.
Absolutely.
And they had their banter. They deeply loved each other. They met in London, even though they were both from Sydney, in the 1950s when they were both at the studio of Covent Garden. At that time, most of the people who were at the studio came from, quote, the Empire. So John Vickers, a Canadian tenor, was there, but they were not Americans because we were not part of the Empire. We had that disagreement in 1776.
Oh, that.
The Canadians, the Australians, the New
Do
Zealanders.
you think they might take us back, by the way?
It would be okay. But so the Bonynges not only were exposed to Covent Garden and got to know John Vickers, but they also saw England and Great Britain in a time of privation right after World War II. They saw all the greatest stars of the British theater and film, but especially theater in the theaters. They came to know that whole world. They especially became a friend of Noel Coward. And the thing is that theatrical couples, especially if only one was on the stage, an actress or an actor, as opposed to both being on the stage, had their own costumes. And Joan had her own costumes. So when she played Anna Bolena, I remember it very well because I touched the costume. She had Jones on a Bolena. She had Jones Lucia. She had Jones Norma. She was a very tall woman. This was clothing that looked good on her. And they were traditional in design. And frankly, the productions that she would arrive in were not all the most traditional, but she wore the costume that was embedded in history and an older practice of doing opera and theater. The costumes were made mostly by a woman named Barbara Matera, who was here in New York. And I
That's right.
remember, maybe you did this too, going to many, many fittings at the Barbara Matera studio for Joan's costumes. And Richard Bonynge, would be there talking about the character and how Joan should move. And you need a certain amount of sleeve there because she will do a gesture in the second act that requires that kind of sleeve. So that the costumes were built, and that's the verb, for the production that they would do well before she even was cast in a production.
Oh
And
yeah,
she
he
had
would
her
come to
set of
my
costumes.
clinic.
So
Yeah,
therefore, when you said that you couldn't wear Joan's costume, it was because they didn't, at Houston Grand Opera, they didn't have a costume that was Joan's because Joan had her own. They would have one for any other artist who would sing on a Bolena or Lucia or whatever Joan came to do.
and
So,
some of those incredible Michael Stennett designs
yeah.
and Barbara's beautiful costumes. And when we did the Norma that we did for that new production, they were John Pascoe's
Hmm.
dresses, but Bonynge had them designed from Bellini's own sketches,
Yes.
from his fantastical sketches of what he wanted to look like. So they were incredibly romantic and these beautiful things. And we had these huge wreaths and everything from Bellini's sketchings. Maestro Bonynge remains such an incredible student
Now I keep
of
saying
every.
we will get to, but I want to say one more thing about them as a couple. Um,
Yes.
what I always noticed about them, and I usually was with them in New York, but not only, but usually here in New York, um, that by about the fourth or fifth performance in the run, they were itching to go. They were thinking of their next engagement. They lived on the road. They had their home in Switzerland. They had their home in Sydney, where their son was. But they were people when they were not at home who were on the road.
Yeah.
And they would, if the next stop was Vancouver, as it often was, they would be thinking already about what they'd be doing in Vancouver while performing in New York. Or if the
Yes.
next stop was London, and they would contact their friends in London whom they wanted to see, and everything would be put into place while they were still in New York. And there's a wonderful book that I don't remember the title, but it's about their home in Switzerland, which was called Les Avants. I don't know if you have that book. That's basically not just their house, but really his library and his collecting, because he's the one who is the great scholar. He's still very much alive as we record this, who's the great scholar who would spend endless times in the archives of the Paris Opera, researching roles by Massenet, alternative versions of Offenbach's Les Contes d'Hoffmann, the Tales of Hoffmann, and he would go along the banks of the Seine in Paris and go to book stalls, and if there was an illustration, a watercolor from 1861 of a particular minor character in an opera, he would buy it. So therefore, their home in Switzerland contained his erudition, his study, and that's why he, more than any other conductor I've ever known, could say to Nova Thomas in Houston, we're going to adjust it slightly because that's how it looked in the picture from 1861.
Exactly. As I was sorry to interrupt you. He would come to the costume fittings for the things and make sure that it looked just right, that it belonged to the character and little details. Can you breathe? Can somebody loosen her corset there? We need that. We need a bigger breath there. Or can she move this way? Or how does this look? Nova, does this feel right to you? He had that eye, still has that eye an incredible collector. One of my favorite
Yeah.
memories is going antiquing with him and shopping with him. And he would be so ashamed. He would send me to go forth. I remember we were in San Diego performing, and he said, "Go over there, dearie, see if you can get it for a bit less." Because, of course, I had no qualms about that, but it shamed him to no end. Um, a great collector. They gave me for my first Fille du Régiment, they gave me a picture of Jenny Lind from the period
Wow.
in this gorgeous frame, an etching of her. They gave me for Traviata my first a first edition of the book. They gave me a score to man. I mean, some beautiful, beautiful gifts. But his eye for things. She always wore that gorgeous patti, of course,
Mhm.
face, that locket. He knew he had an eye for that, an expertise for that, and a love for that. He could touch something and feel the history and the power and the love of it. I have to tell you, one of the most loving things I ever witnessed in my life and being able to spend time with them. We were in Sydney. Dame Joan was sitting on the sofa over to the right, doing her needlework. Maestro
Mhm.
Bonynge was sitting in a chair with a crossword puzzle in hand. And we were all sitting around watching some sort of television show. We had had a great dinner. Chester, beloved Chester, was with us. We were all there, and just out of the blue, without looking up from the puzzle, he said, "Oh, Nova, I wish you could have heard Joan sing Donna in the 50s. You could not imagine what it was. You cannot imagine the sound and the gravitas she brought to that character." And she, without picking up, he described it as the most beautiful sound in the world, he said of her. And she said, without dropping a stitch or moving her needle, "And Nova, I would have been nothing without him."
Yep.
And that was the depth of love
Yep.
and the tie, a servant couple. We keep
Mhm.
coming back to that word. And I think of course, you have such wonderful firsthand knowledge of how they would be thinking about the next place. But that was preparing place and space, a place to always go home to,
Mhm.
a place that could be beautiful, a place that would have enough room, a place that could answer her needs for early mornings, his needs for late mornings, a place that they could have people in, people they wanted to see. I think they were great planners of space and community wherever they went.
Mhm.
It was always a home they were going to, however temporary.
Obviously, my part of the plan was I was her personal shopper. I
Well, there
got
are
to eat
horse
with them.
chops to be had.
I got to eat with them a little bit in Brooklyn at that wonderful house. Martin Waldron's house was his name.
Yes,
Um, but it was usually, "Hello, Fred. Ricky's working. Here we go to Gimbel's." Okay.
exactly. She loved to shop. Yes, exactly. The only thing I could think of to do for them for my debut as Adalgisa was I thought, what can I give these people? They have everything. There's nothing I can give them. So I took them to Disney World. That was my gift. And I think it's mentioned in her book. I think Brian talked about it as well, but I took them to Disney World in California. And that was a day beyond days. You cannot imagine. Maestro Bonynge was my riding partner because he loved all of the big rides. Dame Joan would wait for us. Chester would go sometimes. And I remember Dame Joan standing at the statue of Snow White singing. And Dame Joan said she was just mesmerized. We spent the whole day there. She loved the flowers. We walked everything. Maestro Bonynge and I rode the rides. We did everything. And then thank God it was near the end of our day. But when she was standing looking at Snow White and listening to Snow White sing with the little birds and everything, somebody yelled, Joan Sutherland. And she went, oh no, but she was, of course, recognized, and she was generous and kind to the people that then came around her, even people at Disney World. But we left soon after that. But it was a glorious day, a fabulous day that I will always remember, and that gratefully she remembered, and he as well.
So you just triggered a story that I didn't intend to tell. But March 1987, the Met was doing its premiere of its new production of Turandot by Franco Zeffirelli. It was the production, my last new production of my career at the Met. And I had the prerogative on nights like that, if there was some big star who was there that I wanted to be the escort of, I got to be the escort of it. I assigned my assistant to do other things. And, there was one night I had Sophia Loren, another night a week I had Simone Signoret, which was extraordinary. And on this night in March of 1987, I decided that I would be the escort for Birgit Nilsson, the great star of Turandot. Now, I could have had Elizabeth Taylor that night, and that was a hard pick, but I picked Birgit Nilsson.
I don't think either of those prima donnas would fault you for choosing the other.
And as we came down the south aisle of the Met for her to take her place, and the whole theater was already in its place, and Maestro Levine had not yet entered the pit because he knew what I was doing, and that we were going to bring Birgit down the aisle. And as she came down the aisle, the audience, you could hear this roar from the bottom of the orchestra because they saw her. And then when she came out and she could be seen from the tiers, this thunderous sound of Nilsson, it rattled the theater. And Levine came into the pit, but he did not step on the podium to watch this. And as I brought her to her seat, someone pointed at her and said, look, it's Joan Sutherland.
I bet they both loved that.
And Birgit said, there, I love Joan Sutherland. Who was not there that night. This person mistook Birgit Nilsson for Joan Sutherland.
Well, there you go. But two greats, nonetheless. They
But she was so quick. She said, I love Joan Sutherland.
I love her. Yes.
She pushed it off Birgit, and as the whole theater was rocking with the sight of Birgit Nilsson.
They're you were speaking of great theatrical couples. And I cannot spend any time talking about great influences and not specifically name Virginia Zeani and Niccolo Rossilomeni.
Yeah.
Who were after Miss Farrell retired from Indiana University, they are the ones that came in and took over. And they are the ones that ushered me into that chapter of my life that then enjoyed the benefits of people like Dame Joan and Maestro Bonynge. I remember Bonynge describing to me her voice as, he said he heard her in Covent Garden. And he said it was as if someone were unbolting a black velvet.
Yeah.
That it had, her sound was that to him. He was so moved by it. And they were another couple. They were the people that took me to Italy for the first time, but my world got bigger because I got to see Italy through those eyes.
Let me briefly mention about her. Virginia Zeani was a Romanian soprano who had a very long career, and she died not too long ago at a very, very, very old age. And she remained very active in opera after she stopped singing as a teacher, but also as a custodian of memory. And my specific experience of her was the following, that I was invited to Austin, Texas to work on, coach, mentor a production of Poulenc's Dialogues of the Carmelites, Dialogue des Carmélites, in which she was a very prominent performer early on. And they brought her in to basically speak to the cast about Poulenc, about the production, about the meetings of the opera. And so I got to sit and listen to her speak to the cast. And it's a very good example, Nova, of what you said at the very start of our conversation, that this planet opera thing where we don't ever quite know when something will be summoned from us and brought to the fore, and how we, you especially, can be useful. Virginia Zeani before that, Joan Sutherland, Richard Bonynge, all these people before that, in instilling something to pass it on. It's like sharing DNA,
It was
sharing.
exactly
It's
that.
not just wow, I saw Joan Sutherland, but wow, what Joan Sutherland taught me, or wow, what Virginia Zeani could talk about Poulenc that few people could do.
It was incredible. She was a phenomenal artist, a brilliant technician. He also, Callas, their closeness with Maria Callas, Maestro Signor Rosilameni, his influence in her career was heralded by her, most especially. But the two of them together, another example of the artist as servant and what they would do. And I mean, Madame Zeani came from real modest means is a generous way of saying it, in Romania, and coming into to Italy and to singing and never having a rehearsal of Traviata and having to have the chorus ladies do her hair before she sang it, or incredible things, and yet iconic figures on the stage, iconic figures. Of course, he fell madly in love with her, as many did, but he was the one with whom she fell madly in love. And great teachers, generous teachers. What I learned from her about being feminine in music making and in carriage, and understanding the power of that, the responsibility of that in interpreting great heroines, how not to apologize for that, to use that. It was at the soul of so many of these choices and stories. From Signor Rosilameni, of course, the power of theatrics, the power of text. Madame Zeani, the marriage of music and meaning, the ability to believably inhabit these incredible female characters, her love for each of them, the way she would curate from her life experiences to tell a situation for Violetta. Of course, arguably the most beautiful Violetta of all time. And when we've had many beautiful Violettas, many, Callas certainly leaps to the fore, but Virginia Zeani to this day, I think, holds the number of performances and something unique about interpreting the character. Incredible. It was Madame Zeani and Signor Rosilameni that said, in addition to the Verdi and Puccini that you are surely destined to do, you must look at some of these bel canto heroines. There is something there. Verdi came directly from this. If you can sing the Verdi Cantilena, if you can sing this, then you have to know where it came from. And it came from Bellini and Donizetti. And really just so much. And just what it means to live not just in the language of the Italian, but in the imagination of the Italian. His father was a 5-star general, escaped execution 3 times from Mussolini. His father was from those secret societies. Their home, just what it meant to be an Italian, which you have such a beautiful understanding of, Fred. I love you're a born storyteller, but that's what you get. You get the heritage of something, the DNA, as you so aptly said a moment ago. You get the DNA of what it means to be an Italian and to have those words in your mouth. Like,
You know the
very.
opera Attila by
Yes.
Verdi, an early opera, 1846. One of the characters says, Avrai tu l'universo, resti l'Italia a me. You may keep the universe, but let Italy be mine.
Amen. Amen. Well, you understand that in a first person way, in a
Yep.
citizenship way. You're a citizen of the heart as well as the country, but it's incredible. And those I had not thought of them in terms of couples
Mhm.
before you couched our conversation or organized a piece of our conversation around that. And to think that I was blessed by two couples in the art form is
Mhm.
quite something. And the yin and the yang of that, and the magic that happens in between.
There was another couple. I don't know if you ever knew them really, but I knew them because when I grew up in New York City, they were my down the hall neighbors. They were Evelyn and Tom, and I knew them as Evelyn and Tom. And Evelyn was the most loving, kindest neighbor who adored little Freddie. And Tom was a nice man. They were, of course, Evelyn Lear and Thomas Stewart, fantastic singers. But Evelyn Lear was the nicest lady down the hall. And then when I demonstrated an interest in opera, and when one day Hermit Pry came by our house, she said, "What's he doing here?" And I said, "Well, he's an opera singer." And she said at that point, "Well, so am I."
I love it. Little Freddie, little did he
I was
know.
10.
I love it. Well,
And she was
speaking of,
singing, I think at that time she was singing Pamina or Morning Becomes Electra, one or the other at the Met, sort of
or
at the
both at the same
I,
time.
I
He was
know.
incredible. And speaking of Santa Fe, as we sit here in this gorgeous
Yes, and I need to ask
desert,
you, you're in Santa Fe, which we've not covered, one of the
oh,
great opera festivals of the world. What are you doing there?
I am teaching after I made my debut here. So I've had a beautiful full circle courtesy of this opera company and my dear colleague, Gay Letha Nichols, who has
Hmm.
invited me to come here and teach. And I think this is my fifth season doing so. But I really began here with Susan Graham. We made our debut together here doing Così fan tutte
Hmm.
with John at the helm, and it was incredible, an incredible experience. And to come full circle and be back here now as a teaching artist is my great joy. But I have to tell you this about Mr. Thomas and Miss Evelyn, as we all referred to them.
Hmm.
On any given day in the summer, they were real strongholds here in mentoring young people under Mr. Crosby. And they ate at Fur's cafeteria almost every night. One of those places with a sneeze garden where you carry your own food. So they ate early about 5 o'clock. And any artist that arrived, they would pay for our dinner.
Yep.
So any apprentice, especially, because they made little to nothing, gained a wealth of experience, but not known for its money. And they would pick up the tab for anybody that came to Fur's cafeteria around 5 o'clock. Incredibly generous people. And this indeed is a very, very special place. I'm blessed beyond words to be here. I
Yeah.
work with the apprentices when I come, and specifically to prepare them for the all important industry week, where most of the world gathers here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to see the operas that are being done for the season, and then to be introduced to arguably one of the most important collections of young talent in the country. We have these iconic and they are few, truly training programs. And one exists here and has for decades. The training is storied here
Hmm.
and devoted to the next generation of singers. And I am quite honored to be a very small member of the team uh, with whom they surround the apprentices.
Now, I'm being very mindful of the fact that you have to go teach and we're on a clock, but I'm going to ask you one more thing. It goes back to Richard Bonynge. He picked you for a recording of a little known opera called The Bohemian Girl, which is not La Boheme, by Michael William Balfe, who was an Irish composer who spent a lot of time in Italy and came to know Luigi Cherubini, was a protege of Rossini. Bonynge taught me all of that. And you mentioned Jenny Lind before. Did you know that Michael William Balfe conducted her premiere, her debut as an opera singer?
No, I certainly did not.
Yes, ma'am. And
Oh my
he's the one who
gosh.
conducted her debut. One of the great stars of the 19th century, the Birgit Nilsson, Joan Sutherland of the 19th century, along with Judith Past and a few others. And it was the composer of the opera whose recording you made as star with Richard Bonynge. How did it come to pass that Maestro Bonynge chose this little known opera by this actually very popular composer that had an aria that Joan sang in concerts and on recording, but not the whole opera? And yet when the time came to record the opera, that he chose you, and talk for 3 minutes before you go off to teach about the experience of making a world premiere recording of an opera by a man who was mentored by Rossini, who conducted Jenny Lind, who somehow fell into the hands of Richard Bonynge and passed it on to you.
It was incredible. Again, just an example of their generosity, not necessarily my appropriateness for the role. It sits very high. It's very florid. That was one of the things my voice did, by the way, not as a main diet. And it was fast and high and hard, and it was incredible. They had an Irish actress do the dialogue, because of course my own speech, especially in words that I recognize, belongs to my Southern dialect and my
Mhm.
Southern roots. But it was an incredible experience with a phenomenal orchestra. Again, Dame Joan came for every rehearsal and every day of it.
Wow.
We recorded in Dublin in the National Theatre because Maestro Bonynge and Decca felt that was a perfect acoustic. It was a favorite acoustic for Decca. And they used it. I learned so much, recording silence in the hall, everything. It was an incredible experience. Bonynge, Dame Jones said, now I want you to trust Richard to do as he did with me. Don't do any of the listening. Just let him go in the booth. You come sit with me. He'll make the right choice for you. She never listened
Wow.
to herself. And she encouraged me to do the same. So he would go in the booth, and there were few things we did second takes of. He never believed in putting pieces of things together. If something needed to be redone, we redid the entire scene because he believed in the arc of
Mm-hmm.
something.
Yep.
We felt you could, even in the hands of these experts of Decca, he just said, it's not the same. We won't piece anything. Nothing is to be pieced. So we would do these entire huge sections if anything needed to be repeated. Hence, very little ever was
Right.
for her, or certainly, and this time for me. Um, Another example of their generosity and their kindness, and to give me that opportunity, and with that great recording company, and with
Yeah.
the two of them. I mean, it was incredible. And the symphony there was fantastic. It was and to do it in that place
Mm-hmm.
lended great meaning to be there to tell that story. It was wonderful. I have to tell you one extra story, and I know but if I'm a minute late, I'm a minute late. I called Dame Joan one time just to say hello. I'm not a person that stays in touch. I'm not very good at that, but I called her one time and she said, I just wanted to check in with you and see how you are. They were in Switzerland, what you're doing. And she said, oh, dearie, I'm so glad you've called. And I said, well, I know it's your gardening time, so I'm not going to keep you. I'd calculated my hours. I knew that she loved being in the garden and loved working the garden herself. And she said, oh, I've just come in. And she said, let me tell you something. I've gone into Richard's office, which I never do. And I decided to listen to a recording of myself. And I said, Dame Joan. And she said, I listened to my Lucia Nova. And she said, I sat there like a child. I couldn't believe that was me. I think I was very good, she said.
Oh my goodness.
Said, Dearie, I think I was very good. I said, indeed, Dame Joan, I think you were.
It was her Lucia when she was older. She was 56. And we did it with Joan and Alfredo Kraus, another god of mine, at the Met. And, you know, they were both in their 50s and extraordinary. And she kept calling him beauteous man, and he didn't know what that meant. And but I would go in the wings for their duets and for his solos at the end of the opera, but for the mad scene, 18 minutes, and she would run barefoot along that set, all the while singing trills at the age of 56, and it was just the jaw would drop.
It was a lesson, but it comes from, we all have a passion for the art form. I think all of us that have been blessed to make it have a passion for it. There's another thing to have a talent for it. And the talent for it includes work, the work. That's where the work comes in, and the level of devotion and the commitment to that. And she was, in addition to being gifted, so very, very talented, she would come to serve, to give. And these couples I've been blessed by, Eileen Farrell, the many great coaches I've been blessed to stand in the crook of a particular piano. They all had that in common, a generosity of spirit, a commitment to something larger than themselves. And Fred, I have to thank you. I have two things I'd like to say to you before we go say goodbye.
And then you better work.
Then I have to work. The first is, can we please have a part 2? Because I want to talk to you about the magic of moving into teaching. So that's my first request. The second thing I have to do is to thank you for mentoring and modeling the way for artist citizen, for kind and loving and deeply human participation in this art form. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for recognizing a girl from Louisville, North Carolina, and for making my own dreams and imagination for myself a bit larger. And I thank you for a lifetime of putting beauty into a world that so desperately needs it. Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much.
I'll only add I have very good taste.
I'm grateful to be a morsel of your banquet.
That's why it's part of that girl from North Carolina.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Nova Thomas, and keep up the good work.
I will. Thank you. Thank you.